Welcome back. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and today we are taking a look at the Scuba from Roebuck Watch Company. It's really no secret that there are a ton of dive watches out there, yet this is one that caught my attention, and it did so with its combination of retro 70s styling, an octagonal cushion case, a fume sandwich dial, and a rather interesting integrated rubber strap that's not completely integrated. Now, the Scuba is a Kickstarter watch, and I believe it's launching in early July. It's also the second watch from Roebuck Watch Company, with the first being their rather cool Divisio. While the name Scuba is a little plain, the watch itself is anything but. And thanks to that strap design, as well as the vibrant use of color, when I first saw this thing, I thought it was some sort of racing-inspired diver. Now, I'm not sure if that's actually intentional, but this is definitely a watch that stands out. Before we really jump into it, there are two things I need to point out here. The first is that this is a prototype and that it was lent into the channel. Therefore, there may be some changes to the final production version, which is pretty standard stuff when it comes to prototypes and Kickstarters these days. The second is that when they asked if I wanted to review the watch, one of the bigger reasons I said yes had nothing to do with the watch itself. Rather, the owner Guy and Roebuck itself is based out of Round Rock, Texas. And for those not familiar with Texas, Round Rock is just north of Austin, and it's actually the home of Dell Computers. So I agreed to do the review because I've been wanting to look at more Texas-based brands, as it's always nice to look at something local when you can. As well as I actually lived pretty close to Round Rock for a number of years, and I spent a lot of time there. In fact, I was kind of hoping they would include some Round Rock donuts when they shipped the watch up, but alas, the box just had the watch. So looks like we're going to have to push forward without an overdose of sugar. Now, when it comes to specs, we are looking at a 42mm wide watch without, and about 45.6 with the crown. Lug to lug is just over 47, and it has a total thickness of 11.75, which does include the custom embossed caseback and a rather flat sapphire crystal. You're also looking at 300 meters of water resistance with a signed screw-down crown, as well as a sapphire insert on the bezel and a Miyota 90S5 movement. So overall, it's pretty standard for a diver, and that also includes the 20mm lug width, which is where these sort of integrated straps come into play. Now, I'll go into the straps in more detail near the end, but they do connect to the watch with a standard 20mm spring bar. So while it does look like it's integrated in the flat edge of the cushion case, you can easily swap this out for some standard 20mm straps. The trick with that is that there's not a lot of clearance between the spring bar and the case. And even a curved spring bar doesn't help a whole lot here. So you're only going to be able to use this with bracelets or straps that have a fairly thin endpoint, which is a little bit of a negative. But luckily the rubber strap it comes with is quite good. And the watch as a whole on your wrist is also pretty comfortable. Now, due to the rather minimal case design and this rather wide expansive dial, the Scuba looks like a bigger watch. Yet remember that this is only 42mm wide. And with that 47mm lug to lug, I'd say it wears rather true to that. So it wears like a moderate-sized diver, just one with a rather large visual presence. Now, with the rubber strap, it is fairly lightweight, and it conforms comfortably and sits squarely where it needs to on your wrist, as well as being quite balanced on the wrist with its deployant clasp. The only problem I ran into is the clasp is rather thick, and that's something you do feel as you rest your wrist on a table. The overall case shape is rather angular and geometric. It's basically a brushed octagon. Yet when you start taking a closer look, you do notice a few interesting details, such as the midline that runs halfway through the case, and that's where it slopes downward and then tapers back just slightly before getting to your wrist. Or how the finishing changes as it goes across the case, where the very outer edge has a horizontal brushing, yet the top of the lugs has a vertical that leads your eyes right towards the strap. Or how the very top of the case seems to have more of a bead-blasted finish than the sides. There isn't much of that metal exposed, but I think this creates a really cool effect, as it creates a duller backdrop against the very vibrant red bezel, and that just makes it really pop out at you. Then at the right, we have a nice sized crown that rests inside a small notch of the case. The crown is screwed in and it is signed, as well as it has this loomed ring around the outer edge. And with its knurling, I found it always easy to unscrew and use, as well as it matches the bezel nicely. Now, other than the bezel being slightly misaligned, I think it's overall pretty good. It's 120 click, unidirectional, and it has that sapphire insert, which not only pairs nicely with the rubber strap, but it also contrasts and frames the silver dial underneath. The design of the bezel is very detailed, with a rather intricate minute track that runs around. which normally I don't think is needed on a bezel, but the dial itself is rather clean and it lacks its own chapter ring. So I think the detail is needed here, as that lets the bezel act as an extension of the dial. Now the last few divers I've seen have had some really hard to turn bezels, and just like those, this one doesn't stick out at all and it's not very tall. So I was kind of expecting this one to be just as difficult, but I was pleasantly surprised at how easy this one is to turn. I guess the knurling adds just the right amount of grip. Now there is a little more backplay than I would like, but it still has a good audible and tactile click as you turn it. Now flipping the watch over, we can see that it has a rather embossed caseback, complete with all the particulars as well as a sea turtle design. Overall it's really well done, it has a nice amount of depth and it's really smooth to the touch. Plus, they get some bonus points for being perfectly lined up. However, there is something missing here, and some of you may have already caught this. Notice that there aren't any notches to unscrew the case back, which caused me to take a closer look, and I didn't find any sort of lip that indicated a snap-on case back. So I contacted Roebuck just to ask him what's going on here. They got back to me and let me know that this is a push-down case back, but they're very clear in specifying that it isn't a cheap version that, say, Timex uses. Rather, you actually need a special tool to take this thing off. And that is one thing I really don't like here. Personally, I've never had a good experience with snap-on casebacks, and I don't like the idea of needing a special tool just to take the caseback off. Plus, I'd rather just have a screw-down caseback like most other divers out there. However, there is some good news with this as well, as evidently the reason the caseback is perfectly lined up is because it is a push-down. That and the factory will be testing every single watch to make sure it has 300 meters of water resistance. So again, I don't like it, but I guess it's not the end of the world. Anyway, let's just move on to the dial. Now at the moment there are 3 different colorways that are planned, and each has their own vibrant and rather unique color scheme. Looking at the 3, I think the silver and red version that I have here is probably going to be the most versatile. But I think there's something really cool about that orange and blue combo. Now the dial here is a very reflective gunmetal gray, which includes both the sunburst pattern and a fume gradient that goes to black as you get to the outer edge. And as this is a sandwich dial, there are going to be 2 different layers. You'll have a lower layer with white lume and an upper layer with cutouts showing off part of that lower dial. The hour indices are made out of these pill-shaped cutouts, and those circle the dial, with single elongated ovals for most of the indicators and double cutouts for the cardinal points, which winds up creating a rather subtle crosshair effect, but I don't think it's as effective as regular non-sandwich dials. Moving to the center, we have the usual amount of text, model and water resistance at the bottom, and you have the logo and brand name at the top. Now, personally, I'd prefer it if they streamlined the upper section here, but because the dial is so clean and expansive, it only clutters it up a little bit. And lastly, we have the lance-shaped hands, as well as an elongated arrow for the seconds. The hands have a brushed metal frame, which is then filled with white luminous paint. The overall length is pretty good, and I think they work rather well with the design. Yet on this particular colorway, there's not a lot of contrast between the hands and the gray dial, and I think they can occasionally get lost in that sea of gray, and especially the second hand. So perhaps a black PVD or red painted hands would have been better here. Otherwise, that's pretty much it when it comes to the design. It's rather simple and clean. And especially because there is no chapter ring on the dial. Rather, they opted for that more complex bezel design, which winds up acting as an extension. And that's something I really noticed when I was setting the watch. I'm rather OCD about lining everything up, and here when you're in between the indicators, you have to line it up with the bezel rather than the dial. Now, even though the design is rather straightforward, it's not boring at all. Thanks to the different colors, textures, and layers, there's a lot of visually interesting elements here, which when combined with that expansive dial, give this modest-sized watch a huge presence. It still has a tool watch feel to it, yet it's a tool watch with some style. And one other thing to note is that while this watch is dateless, I believe there is going to be a date version offered for the Kickstarter. But let's move on to the lume. First off, I absolutely love the way this looks when it's all loomed up, especially with the two-tone look, where it's using a combination of green C3 and blue BGW9 Superluminova. Overall, it's really well done, and the design itself gets 2 thumbs up. However, it lacks any sort of staying power, which is a pity as this is a sandwich dial, and that's one thing they are known for. So that's one thing that's really keeping this from being a great diver. And you can see that just by watching how it compares to the Vostok on its left. Now, this is one area that they said they are working on improving, and I really hope they follow up on that, as they just need to get the dial up to the same level as the lume on the crown, as that's one part here that's going the distance. Now, as for the movement, Roebuck has decided to go with a Miyota 9000, where they'll use either a 90S5 for the dateless version or a 9015 for the date. Now, I'm a big fan of these movements. The rotor can be a little loud, but as high beat movements go, this offers a lot of bang for your buck compared to Swiss alternatives. Let's move on to the strap, and there is a lot to like here. They do need to add some fine tuning, but overall it's really nice and comfortable. It also looks great with this two-tone black and red combination. I also absolutely love how it integrates into the case. And the milled deployant clasp they use is fantastic. It is beefy, but it's very easy to use. The only hitch is getting the strap fed into that deployant clasp, as it's a pretty tight fit, and honestly it can get pretty frustrating when you're trying to do it. Luckily, this is something they know about and something they're working on improving. Also, for those that are interested in a bracelet, I believe right now they're thinking of adding one as a stretch goal. Here's a mock-up that they had on their Facebook page, and I think it looks really cool. It gives off a little bit of a Royal Oak vibe, but it's still very much its own thing. Lastly, let's talk value. Now, I think the full retail price is going to be $600, but the Kickstarter early bird pricing is starting at $400. Which, as a whole, I think is a little bit high, but not by much. It's right in line with what I've seen a lot of other Miyota 9015 watches going for these days, but with most of those you are getting a bracelet, so there's a little bit of a hidden value here. Now, there are no shortage of dive watches out there, and especially so when you're talking microbrands. Yet, I think the really successful ones seem to have a design that simultaneously feels very familiar, yet still has a very distinct visual style. One that drastically separates it out from the hordes of homage watches out there, which I think is exactly what Roebuck has done here. The Scuba is a little retro and a little modern, all rolled up in a very vibrant style of its own. While the name Scuba is a little dull and generic, the watch is anything but, and I'll be eager to see how the Kickstarter turns out. But in the meantime, let me know down below what you think about the Roebuck Scuba. Or if there's another upcoming Kickstarter watch you're more interested in, mention that as well. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.